Imagine walking into your own sister's wedding after years of silence, only to hear your parents raise a glass and publicly declare that they wished your sister had been their only child. The guests laughed. The whispers spread through the ballroom like wildfire. Even your own sister looked at you with the quiet confidence of someone who believed you would always remain the family's greatest disappointment. I stood there without arguing, without defending myself, and without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing me break. They thought they knew exactly who I was. They believed the story they had told about me for years. But there was one person in that room who knew the truth, and he could no longer stay silent. Just minutes later, before the celebration could continue, the groom walked straight toward me, lowered his head in front of hundreds of stunned guests, and said, "It's an honor to have my boss here." In a single heartbeat, every smile disappeared. Every cruel word suddenly carried a terrible price. What followed was far more than a shocking family secret. It became a night that exposed decades of betrayal, buried lies, stolen dreams, and a truth so powerful, it changed every relationship in that room forever. If you stay with me until the very end, I promise you'll experience every twist, every emotional revelation, and a conclusion where dignity, justice, and grace become the greatest victory of all. Evelyn Cole. I was 38 years old, the founder and CEO of Cole Logistics, a company I had spent 2 decades building from nothing into a respected national business. To the outside world, I was known as a calm negotiator, a disciplined leader, and a woman who never let emotions cloud her judgment. But long before boardrooms and business magazines knew my name, I had been nothing more than the forgotten daughter in a family that never believed I belonged. As the groom's words echoed through the silent ballroom, I didn't move. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on me, waiting for an explanation that would come later. But before anyone could understand how I had become the person standing before them, they would have to understand the girl I used to be. Growing up, I learned very early that my place in the family had already been decided. My younger sister, Noreen, could do no wrong. She was bright, charming, effortlessly graceful, and always knew exactly what to say to make people smile. At family gatherings, relatives crowded around her with warm hugs and endless compliments. "What a beautiful little girl. She's going to accomplish wonderful things. She has your mother's elegance." Meanwhile, I usually stood somewhere near the edge of the room holding a book, pretending not to notice that no one had asked about my report card or my latest science project. I wasn't jealous of Noreen. At least, not at first. I simply wondered what I had done wrong. When I was 7 years old, I came home carrying a certificate for finishing first in my school's academic competition. I was so excited that I nearly tripped running through the front door. "Mom, Dad, look!" My mother glanced at the paper for barely 2 seconds before placing it on the kitchen counter. "That's nice, Evelyn." Then she returned to helping Noreen practice a piano recital. I stood there waiting. Surely there would be more. There wasn't. Later that evening, my father finally noticed the certificate lying on the counter. He adjusted his glasses, looked at it briefly, then shrugged. Book smarts don't make someone successful. That was all. The excitement I'd carried home disappeared as quietly as it had arrived. Moments like that became ordinary. Every achievement felt smaller inside our house than it did anywhere else. By middle school, I'd stopped bringing home certificates altogether. Teachers praised me constantly. They encouraged me to dream bigger, to apply for advanced programs, to consider universities that most students only imagined attending. Home was different. Whenever I spoke excitedly about school, my mother grew strangely uncomfortable. One afternoon when I was 16, I rushed home after receiving perfect grades once again. I got straight A's. She stared at me for several seconds before forcing a smile. "I was smart once, too." I waited for the rest. Instead, she quietly added, "Look where it got me." I didn't understand what she meant. Before I could ask, she walked away. That wasn't the only confusing moment. Sometimes she looked at me with an expression I couldn't describe. Not anger, not disappointment, something closer to regret. Once, she gently touched my cheek and whispered, "You were born old, Evelyn." Then she immediately left the room, as though she'd revealed something she hadn't intended to say. My father was even harder to understand. He never yelled. He never hit me. Sometimes, I wished he had. Bruises heal. Silence lasts much longer. There were evenings when I would walk into the living room and catch him staring at me. Not with affection. Almost confusion. His eyes lingered just a second too long before he looked away. Occasionally I'd hear him mutter under his breath, "You don't look anything like me." I assumed he meant my personality. I was quiet, reserved, more comfortable with books than parties. I didn't know those words carried a meaning far deeper than I could imagine. By the time I reached high school, studying had become more than a hobby. It became my escape. Libraries felt warmer than my own home. Teachers became the adults whose approval mattered. Every late night spent reading convinced me that somewhere beyond our front door existed a life where effort actually meant something. Then came Harvard. Even saying the name felt impossible. One of my teachers secretly helped me prepare the application because she believed I had a genuine chance. I worked for months. Every essay, every recommendation, every interview. When I mailed the application, I barely allowed myself to hope. Weeks passed. Then, months. Every afternoon, I checked the mailbox before anyone else came home. Nothing. Finally, one evening, I asked my parents whether any university letters had arrived while I was at school. My father didn't even look up from his newspaper. If they wanted you, they would have answered by now. A week later, he casually informed me that Harvard had rejected my application. Not everyone gets what they want. My mother nodded quietly from across the room. Maybe college isn't the path you're meant to take. That night I cried harder than I ever had. Not because Harvard had rejected me. Because for the first time, I believed maybe I truly wasn't good enough. The dream that had carried me through years of loneliness disappeared in a single conversation. Looking back now, I realize something inside me changed forever that evening. I stopped believing life would ever hand me an opportunity simply because I deserved it. If I wanted a future, I would have to build one with my own hands. I just didn't know yet how much had already been stolen from me before I ever had the chance to begin. The night I was told Harvard had rejected me, something inside me quietly shut down. I stopped asking for encouragement because I had learned none was coming. I stopped waiting for someone to tell me I was enough because every conversation at home seemed to confirm the opposite. A few months later, after graduation, I packed a single suitcase, tucked $200 into my wallet, and decided I would rather fail on my own than spend another year living as someone else's disappointment. Leaving should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful. No one tried to stop me. My mother stood silently in the kitchen as I carried my suitcase toward the front door. She never asked where I planned to live or whether I had enough money. She simply watched with an expression I couldn't understand, as though she wanted to speak but no words would come. My father barely looked up from his coffee. "If you're determined to make mistakes," he said flatly, "don't expect us to rescue you." I nodded. "I won't." Those were the last words we exchanged for 15 years. There was one more heartbreak waiting for me before I left town. I had been dating a young man named Daniel for nearly a year. He wasn't the love of my life, but he represented hope. We had dreamed about finding jobs in the same city and building a future together. I believed, perhaps naively, that at least one person had chosen me. The afternoon before my departure, he asked to meet me at a small park. He couldn't even look me in the eye. "I don't think this is going to work." The words came so quickly, they hardly sounded real. I asked why. He shrugged. "Our lives are going in different directions." There was something rehearsed about the explanation, something hollow. Within minutes, he was gone, leaving me sitting alone on a weathered bench with tears running down my face. At the time, I blamed myself. I assumed I simply wasn't worth staying for. Years later, I would discover that my father had quietly paid Daniel $5,000 to end our relationship, believing heartbreak would convince me to stay home and accept the future he wanted for me. Instead, it only strengthened my resolve. When the sun rose the next morning, I climbed onto a bus with my suitcase and never looked back. The city welcomed me with noise, traffic, and indifference. No one knew my name. No one cared where I had come from. Oddly enough, that felt freeing. For the first several weeks, I lived in a tiny apartment, barely large enough for a bed and a folding chair. I took temporary jobs wherever I could find them, answering phones, organizing files, serving coffee, anything that paid enough to keep the lights on. Some evenings I skipped dinner to save money. Other nights I fell asleep wearing my coat because I couldn't afford to keep the heater running. Still, every morning I reminded myself of one thing. No one here expected me to fail. One rainy afternoon, after receiving yet another rejection from a job interview, I ducked into a quiet coffee shop to escape the weather. My folder of resumes was damp from the rain, and as I tried to organize the papers, someone accidentally bumped my table. The entire stack scattered across the floor. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry." I looked up to see a distinguished man in an immaculate gray suit, kneeling to help gather my papers before I could react. He smiled warmly. "I believe I've created quite a mess." "It's all right," I replied, embarrassed. As he handed back the final page, his eyes paused briefly on my name. Evelyn Cole. There was the slightest flicker of recognition across his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "That's a fine name." He introduced himself as Wallace Cole, the chief executive of a logistics company located only a few blocks away. We talked for nearly half an hour. Unlike most people, he didn't ask why someone my age wasn't already settled into a career. Instead, he asked what I enjoyed learning, what problems fascinated me, what kind of future I imagined building. No one had ever asked me questions like that before. When I explained that I loved solving complex logistical puzzles and organizing systems, his smile widened. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I'm actually looking for a new executive assistant." I laughed softly. "I'm probably not qualified." "That's not what I asked." He leaned forward. "I asked whether you're willing to learn." Without thinking, I answered honestly. "I've been willing to learn my entire life." His eyes softened. "I can tell." 3 days later, I walked into his office for my first day. Working with Wallace felt different from anything I had experienced before. He never treated me like an employee whose purpose was simply to follow instructions. He taught. Every meeting became a lesson. Every mistake became an opportunity to improve, instead of an excuse for criticism. He explained contracts, negotiations, transportation networks, finance, leadership, and most importantly, people. "Numbers matter," he often said. "But people determine whether numbers survive." Whenever I became frustrated, he refused to let me surrender. "Grace," he told me one afternoon after a difficult negotiation, "is not weakness. It's the strongest weapon you'll ever possess, because people never expect strength to arrive quietly." Those words stayed with me. As months turned into years, Wallace's guidance transformed every part of my life. He introduced me to professionals who challenged me to think bigger. He encouraged me to attend conferences where I felt hopelessly inexperienced. Whenever an opportunity appeared just beyond my reach, somehow he seemed to know exactly how to push me toward it without ever making it feel like charity. Occasionally, I caught him watching me with an expression that felt oddly familiar. Not pride exactly. Something deeper. Almost personal. One evening, after we successfully completed a major project, I finally asked the question that had lingered in my mind for years. "Why have you invested so much time in me?" For several long seconds he remained silent, staring through the office window toward the city lights. Finally he smiled, though sadness lingered behind his eyes. "You remind me of someone I lost a very long time ago." I waited for him to explain. He never did. At the time, I accepted the answer. I had no idea that the greatest truth about my life had been sitting across the desk from me all along, patiently waiting for the day I would finally be ready to hear it. Looking back now, I realize Wallace never tried to give me an easy life. What he gave me was something far more valuable. He gave me a chance to discover what I was capable of before the world convinced me otherwise. That chance became the foundation of everything that followed. After nearly 5 years of working beside him, I reached a point where I no longer wanted to build someone else's dream. I wanted to build my own. The idea terrified me. I had no wealthy family standing behind me, no powerful last name that opened doors, no safety net if I failed. All I had was experience, relentless discipline, and a mentor who believed I was thinking too small. One evening, after we finished reviewing quarterly reports, Wallace closed the folder in front of him and looked directly at me. "You've already outgrown this office." I laughed. "I've barely learned enough to survive." "No," he replied quietly. "You've learned enough to lead." Those words stayed with me for weeks. Eventually, I resigned. It wasn't an emotional goodbye. Wallace simply stood, shook my hand, then surprised me by pulling me into a brief embrace. "I'm proud of you," he said. It was the first time anyone had ever spoken those words to me. I carried them with me every single day afterward. At 23, I rented a tiny warehouse with peeling paint, secondhand furniture, and a phone system that only worked when it wanted to. That warehouse became the first office of Cole Logistics. There were no assistants, no executives, no investors, just me. I answered customer calls, negotiated contracts, organized deliveries, balanced the books, swept the warehouse floor, and often drove shipments myself when employees became sick. Some nights I slept on a worn couch because driving home would have wasted precious hours I couldn't afford to lose. Failure wasn't simply a possibility. It was waiting outside the door every morning. The logistics industry wasn't exactly welcoming to young women either. Many clients assumed I was someone's receptionist. More than once, I walked into meetings carrying my presentation, only to hear someone ask, "When is your boss arriving?" "I am the boss." The expressions that followed were almost always identical. Surprise, doubt, occasionally amusement. One executive actually smiled and folded his arms before saying, "Sweetheart, this contract is worth millions. Maybe bring someone with a little more experience next time." For a brief second, I felt 16 years old again, standing in my parents' kitchen, wondering why nothing I accomplished ever seemed enough. Then Wallace's voice echoed in my memory. "Grace is not weakness." Without raising my voice, I opened my presentation and calmly walked him through every weakness in his company's transportation network. I showed him exactly where shipments were delayed, how inventory losses were accumulating, and why his current logistics provider was quietly costing him millions every year. By the time I finished, no one in the room was smiling anymore. The executive leaned back slowly. "You figured all this out?" "I did." He extended his hand across the table. "When can you start?" Moments like that slowly changed my reputation. People stopped remembering my age. They started remembering my results. Still, building a business remained painfully difficult. Every new contract meant another risk. Every employee I hired represented another family depending on my decisions. Whenever payroll approached, I checked the company accounts dozens of times, making sure every member of my team would be paid before I paid myself. I remembered what financial uncertainty felt like. I refused to let anyone working beside me experience it if I could prevent it. Years passed. The warehouse expanded into larger facilities. The small team became dozens, then hundreds. We developed software to improve shipping efficiency, entered new markets, and gradually earned contracts with companies that once wouldn't even return my phone calls. Industry magazines began noticing. Someone coined the nickname, the Iron Dove. At first I disliked it. It sounded theatrical. But reporters explained that I had earned the reputation because I negotiated fiercely while treating competitors and employees with unusual fairness. Apparently that combination had become rare. By the time I turned 33, Cole Logistics had grown into a company valued at nearly $50 million. The success looked glamorous from the outside. Inside, my life remained surprisingly quiet. I rarely attended social events. My apartment was comfortable, but modest. I never married. Trust had become something I offered cautiously, if at all. The little girl who once waited for approval at the kitchen table still lived somewhere inside me. She simply learned how to hide better. Occasionally, I searched my family's names online. I saw photographs of charity galas where Noreen smiled beside our parents. Articles described my father's real estate business and his influence within local society. There was never any mention of me. It was as though I had vanished from their history. For years, I convinced myself that was exactly what I wanted. Then life changed again. Wallace became ill. He never complained. Even during chemotherapy, he continued coming into the office whenever he had enough strength. Only after he insisted I accompany him to one of his medical appointments did I understand how serious the diagnosis truly was. Late-stage cancer. The words landed like stones. He accepted them with remarkable calm. "I've had a good life," he told me afterward while we sat outside the hospital watching people hurry through their ordinary afternoons. "I only regret the things I left unfinished." I wanted to ask what those unfinished things were. Instead, I simply sat beside him. Sometimes silence carried more respect than questions. 2 years later, he was gone. His funeral reflected exactly who he had been. Private. Dignified. No unnecessary displays. Only family, close friends, and a handful of colleagues whose lives he had quietly transformed. After the service, his attorney approached me. "There is something Mr. Cole wanted you to have." He placed a sealed envelope into my hands. Across the front, written in Wallace's unmistakable handwriting, were only my name and a single instruction. "Open this when the time is right." "What does that mean?" I asked. The attorney offered an apologetic smile. "He told me you would understand when the moment arrived." "I don't." "You will." Confused, I placed the envelope inside my briefcase. For days afterward, I considered opening it. Each time, I stopped myself. If Wallace had trusted that timing mattered, I would honor that trust. 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived at my office. The elegant cream-colored invitation carried my family's surname embossed across the front. Inside was an invitation to my younger sister's wedding. No handwritten note. No apology. No acknowledgement that 15 years had passed. Only the words, "Family plus guest." I stared at the card for a long time before quietly setting it beside Wallace's unopened letter. At that moment, I had no idea that those two envelopes contained the beginning and the end of the same story. I couldn't stop looking at the two envelopes resting on my desk. One carried the memory of the man who had believed in me when I had nothing. The other carried the name of the family that had spent years pretending I no longer existed. For several days, I ignored both, convincing myself I had more important things to focus on. But life has a strange way of refusing to let unfinished chapters remain closed forever. Late one evening, just as I was preparing to leave the office, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. For a moment, I honestly thought I was imagining it. She hadn't called me in 15 years. I answered without speaking. "Evayun?" Her voice sounded older than I remembered. Softer somehow, yet carrying the same cautious distance that had always existed between us. "I received your invitation," I finally replied. There was a brief silence. "I'm glad." Another silence followed. Neither of us seemed to know how to speak to the other anymore. Finally, she cleared her throat. "I hope you'll come." I waited. "I also hope." She hesitated. "I hope you won't embarrass anyone." The words settled over me with surprising familiarity. Not, "How have you been?" Not, "I've missed you." Not even, "I'm sorry." Instead, after 15 years, her greatest concern was whether I might somehow become an inconvenience. "Noreen deserves a perfect wedding," she continued carefully. "Please just sit quietly in the back. Smile if someone speaks to you. Don't make this about old family disagreements." Old family disagreements. As though decades of rejection could be summarized with a polite phrase. "I understand," I answered evenly. The call ended less than 2 minutes later. I remained standing beside my office window long after the line went dead, looking out across the city skyline that had become my home. The lights below stretched endlessly into the distance. Somewhere among them stood warehouses bearing my company's logo, offices filled with employees I cared deeply about, and clients whose businesses trusted mine every day. I had spent years building a life that no longer depended on anyone's approval. Yet one short phone call had reopened wounds I thought were long healed. The following morning, my executive assistant entered carrying a thick folder. "You have 3 acquisition meetings today." I nodded. "Let's begin." Business had always been the place where my thoughts became clear. Numbers didn't play favorites. Contracts didn't judge childhoods. Markets rewarded preparation rather than popularity. For the next several days, I buried myself in work. We finalized a regional expansion, approved several new hiring initiatives, reviewed proposals for another commercial property acquisition. Every decision reminded me why I loved building companies. Each success represented certainty earned through discipline. Not luck. Not inheritance. Certainly not family connections. Still, every evening, my eyes drifted back toward the wedding invitation lying inside my desk drawer. Eventually, curiosity overcame hesitation. I asked my legal department to prepare a background report on the wedding venue. Not because I intended to interfere. It had simply become second nature to understand any significant property connected to major events. Within an hour, the report arrived. As I skimmed through the documents, one detail immediately caught my attention: the Ashford estate. I smiled faintly. 3 months earlier, Cole Logistics had completed the purchase of a hospitality investment group that owned several luxury event properties. The Ashford estate happened to be one of them. I leaned back in my chair. Of all the venues in the state, Noreen had unknowingly chosen one that now belonged to my company. The irony was almost unbelievable. I considered informing the event management team that I would be attending. Instead, I closed the report. No, I didn't want special treatment. If anything, I preferred remaining unnoticed. That evening, I drove home earlier than usual and opened my closet. Designer gowns filled one side. Elegant business suits occupied the other. I ignored both. Instead, I selected a simple navy dress. Classic, well-tailored, comfortable. Nothing about it suggested wealth. Nothing invited attention. It felt appropriate. I wasn't attending as the CEO of Cole Logistics. I was attending as someone's forgotten daughter. The night before the wedding, sleep refused to come. Instead, memories drifted through my mind one after another. The kitchen where my report cards had gone unnoticed. The front door I had walked through carrying my suitcase. The bus station where I had promised myself I would never return unless I no longer needed anyone's approval. Somewhere during those sleepless hours, I realized something important. I wasn't going because I wanted revenge. If revenge had been my goal, I could have achieved it years earlier. Success had given me opportunities to expose, embarrass, or outshine my family countless times. I had chosen none of them. What I wanted was something far simpler: closure. I wanted to see them one final time and discover whether the little girl inside me still needed answers. If she didn't, I could finally let go. The next afternoon, I instructed my driver to take the day off. He looked confused. "Are you sure, Miss Cole?" "I'm sure." I hailed a taxi instead. As we approached the estate, luxury cars lined the long entrance. Guests stepped from limousines wearing designer clothing and expensive jewelry. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Big wedding." "It seems that way." When we arrived, I paid the fare, thanked him, and stepped onto the stone pathway alone. The estate looked magnificent beneath the late afternoon sun. Fresh flowers decorated every entrance. Music floated gently through the gardens. Staff moved with polished efficiency. For a brief moment, professional instinct replaced personal emotion. The event operations were running flawlessly. Our hospitality division had done excellent work. A young valet approached before stopping abruptly. Recognition flashed across his face. He had probably seen me in business magazines. His mouth opened slightly before he caught himself. "Welcome," he said politely. I returned a small smile. "Thank you." Without another word, he stepped aside. Inside the grand entrance, conversations filled the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished marble floors. Laughter echoed from every corner. I took one slow breath. Then I crossed the threshold into the room where 15 years of silence were about to come to an end. The moment I stepped into the ballroom, the conversations around me softened just enough for whispers to replace them. I had expected curiosity, but I hadn't expected recognition. Faces turned toward me one after another, not because they knew who I had become, but because they remembered who they believed I had been. Isn't that the older daughter? I thought she disappeared years ago. I didn't even know she was invited. Their voices weren't loud, yet they carried effortlessly through the elegant room. I kept walking as though I hadn't heard a single word. The ballroom itself was breathtaking. Towering floral arrangements framed the marble dance floor. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm golden light, while a string quartet performed near enormous windows overlooking perfectly manicured gardens. Every detail reflected wealth, precision, and status. My professional instincts automatically noticed the flawless execution. The catering staff moved with quiet confidence. Every table setting was perfectly aligned. My company's hospitality division had exceeded expectations. No one around me realized I had personally approved the standards that made the evening look so effortless. Before I had taken more than a few steps inside, I heard someone call my name. Evayan. I turned. My mother stood several feet away. For a brief second, neither of us moved. Time had changed her more than I expected. Fine lines framed her face, and the confidence she once carried so naturally seemed replaced by something heavier. She looked tired, not physically, emotionally. She approached quickly, glancing around to make sure no one appeared to be watching too closely. You came. There was relief in her voice, but it wasn't the relief of a mother seeing her daughter after 15 years. It sounded more like someone relieved that a potential disaster hadn't happened. I said I would. She nodded before reaching for my arm. Her fingers tightened more firmly than necessary. Please remember what we discussed. I remember. This day is important. I know. She lowered her voice even further. There are business partners here, investors, friends of your father's. Noreen deserves to enjoy today without unnecessary distractions. I studied her face carefully. For years, I had imagined what this reunion might feel like. Would she apologize? Would she ask about my life? Would she wonder whether I had been happy? Instead, she continued speaking about appearances. You've always been independent, she said. Just, stay in the background today. Something about her expression stopped me from responding immediately. She wasn't looking at me with contempt. She was looking at me with fear. Not fear of me, fear of something else. Before I could ask what was wrong, someone called her name from across the ballroom. She released my arm almost instantly. I have to go. She hurried away without another word. I watched her disappear into the crowd, unable to shake the strange feeling that she hadn't been worried about what I might do. She had been worried about what might happen. An usher approached carrying a seating chart. Miss Cole? Yes. He smiled politely. This way. I followed him through rows of elegantly decorated tables until we reached the farthest corner of the ballroom. My assigned seat sat partially hidden behind a large floral arrangement near one of the support columns. It was impossible not to notice the symbolism. The forgotten daughter had literally been placed where she could barely be seen. I almost laughed. Some things never changed. As I settled into my chair, I noticed an elderly woman sitting several rows ahead. She wore a beautifully tailored lavender suit and a strand of pearls that looked decades old. Despite her age, her posture remained remarkably elegant. Almost as though she sensed my gaze, she slowly turned around. Our eyes met. Instead of curiosity or pity, she smiled. It wasn't the polite smile strangers exchange. It felt familiar. Varm. She held my gaze for several seconds before giving the slightest nod. Then, very clearly, though without making a sound loud enough for anyone else to hear, her lips formed 3 simple words. Welcome home, child. I frowned slightly. Had we met before? I searched my memory, but nothing came. She dabbed gently at one eye with a handkerchief before turning back toward the ceremony preparations. The encounter left me unexpectedly unsettled. Who was she? And why had she looked at me with more affection than my own family ever had? A sudden burst of laughter drew my attention toward the front of the ballroom. My father stood surrounded by several businessmen. He looked almost exactly as I remembered. Perfectly tailored suit. Confident posture. The practiced smile of someone accustomed to admiration. He greeted guests warmly, shook hands enthusiastically, and accepted compliments about the wedding with effortless charm. If he noticed I had arrived, he gave absolutely no indication. To him, I might as well have been another member of the catering staff. Nearby, Noreen stood with her bridesmaids, while photographers directed one picture after another. She looked beautiful, radiant, even. When our eyes finally met across the room, I expected indifference. Instead, something unexpected flickered across her face. The smile disappeared. For the briefest moment, sadness replaced it. There was guilt in her expression, almost regret. Then one of the bridesmaids said something that pulled her attention away, and the familiar smile returned as though nothing had happened. I wasn't sure whether I had imagined what I'd seen. As the musicians prepared for the ceremony, another figure caught my attention. The groom. James Mitchell. I had never met him before. He was speaking with one of the ushers near the entrance when he suddenly looked directly toward me. His expression changed immediately. Recognition. Then surprise. Then unmistakable anxiety. He stared for several seconds before quickly looking away. A moment later, his eyes returned to me. Again. And again. Each time he seemed increasingly uncomfortable. He loosened his tie, adjusted his collar, ran a nervous hand through his hair. It was as though my presence alone had completely unsettled him. Why? We had never met. At least, not that I remembered. Noreen noticed his distraction. She stepped beside him and quietly slipped her hand around his arm. When she realized he wasn't listening, she leaned closer and whispered something I couldn't hear. James answered, without taking his eyes completely off me. Whatever he said, it clearly wasn't what she wanted to hear. Her smile tightened. She gripped his arm more firmly before forcing his attention back toward the guests. I watched the exchange with growing curiosity. Everyone else in the ballroom seemed focused on celebrating the wedding. Only one person looked as though he was attending a trial instead of a ceremony. And somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever burden James was carrying had something to do with me. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. I remained exactly where I had been placed, quietly observing from the back while everyone else celebrated a picture-perfect union. No one invited me into conversations. No one asked me to join family photographs. It was almost comforting in a strange way. I had spent years learning how to become invisible when people wanted me that way. The difference now was that invisibility no longer defined my worth. When the vows were exchanged and the applause filled the ballroom, I found myself genuinely happy for one thing alone. Whatever history existed between my family and me, it didn't belong to the bride and groom's promises. I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that they might build something healthier than the family they were standing inside. As guests moved toward the reception hall, I quietly took my seat once again, content to let the evening unfold without drawing attention to myself. The reception began with laughter, music, and endless rounds of champagne. Servers moved gracefully between the tables while conversations grew louder with every toast. Richard looked completely at ease. This was his world. He knew every executive, every donor, every politician, every influential guest by name. Watching him work the room was almost like watching a seasoned actor perform a role he had perfected over decades. Eventually, someone tapped a champagne glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," the room slowly settled. "It is my great honor to introduce the father of the bride." Applause echoed throughout the ballroom. Richard walked confidently toward the microphone, smiling with practiced warmth. He thanked everyone for attending. He praised the venue. He complimented the catering. Listening from the back, I almost smiled at the irony. Then he turned toward Noreen. "My beautiful daughter." His voice softened. "From the day you were born, you've brought nothing but pride into our family." The guests smiled warmly. "You've always been graceful." More applause. "Kind." Several people nodded. "Loyal." He raised his champagne glass. "And everything a father could ever hope for." Noreen lowered her eyes modestly. while guests clapped once again. Then Richard paused. Just long enough. His eyes slowly swept across the room until they found me. The smile remained on his face. So tonight, he continued smoothly, I'd like to make one more toast. Silence settled over the ballroom. To my one perfect daughter. Another pause. I only wish she had been our only child. The words landed like broken glass. For one endless second, no one reacted. Then uncertain laughter began spreading from table to table. Some guests laughed because they thought it was a joke. Others laughed because everyone else did. Several people glanced toward me with awkward sympathy, before quickly looking away. No one wanted to become involved. I felt every eye in the room searching for my reaction. My heartbeat became strangely calm. Years ago, those words would have shattered me. Tonight they simply confirmed that nothing inside that family had changed. I lifted my water glass and took one quiet sip. Across the room, I noticed my mother's face. She wasn't laughing. She looked down at the tablecloth as though she wished she could disappear beneath it. Her hands were tightly folded together. For the first time all evening, she looked genuinely distressed. Then, I looked toward Noreen. She smiled politely for the guests, but behind the smile, her eyes glistened. She blinked rapidly before lowering her face. Whatever emotion she was fighting, it wasn't triumph. It looked painfully close to shame. Richard seemed satisfied with the applause. He thanked everyone once more before returning to his seat, completely unaware that several guests now looked less impressed than they had only moments earlier. The atmosphere slowly recovered. Dinner was served. Music resumed. Conversations returned. At least on the surface. Something underneath had changed. People no longer ignored my presence. Instead, they stole curious glances in my direction before quickly pretending they hadn't. I noticed the elderly woman again. She turned toward me from across the room. This time she didn't smile. Instead, she gave the smallest shake of her head, almost as though she had witnessed something heartbreaking yet entirely expected. Then she folded her hands quietly in her lap and continued watching the stage. As dinner progressed, Noreen stood to offer a few words. She thanked the guests. She thanked the wedding planners. She thanked her friends for supporting her throughout the years. Her voice remained steady until she reached the subject of family. My family has always, she stopped. The silence lasted only a heartbeat. Been important to me. She forced a smile. Families aren't always perfect. A faint tremor entered her voice. But today reminds me how precious they are. Her eyes found mine across the ballroom. Only for a moment. It was enough. There was an apology inside that look. Not spoken. Not complete. But unmistakable. Before I could fully understand it, James leaned toward her and whispered something. She immediately stiffened. Whatever he had said, she answered with a sharp shake of her head. He spoke again. More urgently this time. Noreen's expression changed from discomfort to alarm. She whispered something back. He didn't seem convinced. The conversation continued in hushed voices, while guests applauded the end of her speech. I couldn't hear a single word. I didn't need to. Their faces told the story. James looked trapped. Noreen looked frightened. Richard noticed them almost immediately. From across the head table, he shot James a warning glance that carried unmistakable authority. Sit down. Stay quiet. Forget whatever you're thinking. James looked away. His fingers tightened around his champagne glass. For several long seconds he remained perfectly still. Then, almost as though he had finally made a decision, he slowly stood. His chair scraped loudly across the polished floor. The sharp sound cut through the ballroom, silencing every conversation. More than 200 guests turned toward him. Noreen reached for his sleeve. He gently pulled away. Richard's face hardened. James, he said firmly, though still smiling for the audience, now isn't the time. James swallowed. His hands were trembling. I know. Richard stood halfway from his chair. Sit down. James closed his eyes briefly before looking directly toward the back of the ballroom. Toward me. The guilt I'd seen on his face all afternoon had disappeared. In its place stood quiet determination. He took one slow step toward the microphone. Then another. Finally, in a voice that carried through the silent ballroom, he said, "Before this celebration continues, there's someone in this room who deserves the truth. And I can't begin my marriage by pretending otherwise." James's words seemed to steal the air from the ballroom. No one moved. Even the musicians lowered their instruments, sensing that whatever was about to happen no longer belonged to a wedding celebration. I remained seated near the back, unable to understand why his eyes never left mine. Richard slowly stood from his chair. His smile had disappeared. "James," he said in a controlled voice, "you're emotional. Sit down before you embarrass yourself." James shook his head. "I've embarrassed myself for months." The room fell even quieter. He reached inside his jacket and removed a cream-colored envelope. His hands trembled, but his voice gradually steadied. "My name is James Mitchell, and before I met Noreen, before any wedding plans were made, I served as the personal attorney for Wallace Cole." A ripple spread through the guests. Several people whispered Wallace's name in surprise. His passing had been covered by every major business publication only weeks earlier. Richard took a step forward. "That's enough." James ignored him. "For the past 5 years, I handled Mr. Cole's private legal affairs. Most of them involved business. A few involved personal matters that remained confidential." He looked directly at Richard. "6 months ago, Mr. Cole informed me that someone had been attempting to gain access to a trust fund he established decades ago." Richard laughed sharply. "This is absurd." "I wish it were." James held up several folded documents. The person seeking access claimed to be entitled to those funds. The silence inside the ballroom became almost unbearable. "My future father-in-law." Gasps echoed from every direction. Richard's face reddened instantly. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about." James's voice remained respectful, but every word carried unmistakable conviction. "You approached me privately. You asked me to prepare legal paperwork that would transfer authority over assets belonging to Wallace Cole's estate." Richard slammed his champagne glass onto the head table. "I asked for nothing illegal. You asked me to create documents that falsely identified you as the rightful trustee." James paused. "When I refused, you reminded me how much influence you had over my career." Several guests exchanged uneasy looks. Richard's reputation in both business and legal circles was well known. "I was told," James continued quietly, "that if I wanted to marry your daughter, cooperation would make my future much easier." Noreen's face turned completely white. She stared at James in disbelief. "No." He looked at her with genuine regret. "I'm sorry. You never told me. I was ashamed." Richard pointed toward the ballroom entrance. "Security." No one moved. His voice became louder. "I said security." The staff remained frozen. No one seemed willing to interrupt what was unfolding. Richard looked around the room in disbelief. "I hired every one of you." Still, no one stepped forward. James continued before Richard could speak again. "I cared about Noreen." His voice softened. "I still care about her." He turned toward his bride. "I wanted to believe I could separate my feelings from what I knew." Tears welled in Noreen's eyes. "I kept telling myself I'd find the right moment to tell the truth." He lowered his head. "But every day I waited, the lie became bigger." Margaret suddenly stood. Her chair scraped loudly across the marble floor. "James." Her voice shook. "You've had too much to drink." He met her eyes calmly. "I haven't touched alcohol all evening." She opened her mouth to argue again, then stopped. For the first time, uncertainty crossed her face. James slowly turned toward me. Everything around us seemed to disappear. "I owe someone here an apology." Every guest instinctively followed his gaze until every eye in the ballroom settled on me. "I've never met you properly," he said, "but I've known your name for years." I remained seated, unable to speak. He took several slow steps toward my table. "I knew Wallace Cole considered you the most important person in his life." My heart skipped. No one outside my closest circle knew that. Richard certainly shouldn't have. I also knew Mr. Cole spent the last years of his life trying to protect something that belonged to you. The envelope in James's hand suddenly felt far more significant than before. He made me promise something. James's voice nearly broke. He said if you ever return to your family, if circumstances finally forced the truth into the open, I was to stop protecting everyone else. He swallowed hard. And start protecting you. The ballroom remained completely silent. Richard took another angry step. You self-righteous fool. James didn't even look at him. I spent months convincing myself that remaining silent was the responsible thing to do. He sighed deeply. But every time I visited Wallace during his illness, he asked me the same question. James's voice became softer, almost as though Wallace himself were speaking through memory. Have you told her yet? James closed his eyes briefly. And every time, I told him no. He looked at me again. The last time I saw him alive, he held my hand and said something I'll never forget. James carefully unfolded the envelope. He said, "When the day comes, don't let fear steal one more year from my daughter." The word daughter sent another wave of confusion through the ballroom. People looked from James to me, then toward Richard and Margaret. Richard's breathing had become visibly heavier. Stop talking. James ignored him. He also told me something else. His eyes filled with emotion. He said you had already lost enough because other people chose silence. I could barely breathe. Nothing made sense anymore. Why would Wallace describe me that way? Why had he entrusted this man with such responsibility? Why had the elderly woman smiled at me like family? James finally reached my table. Without saying another word, he extended the envelope toward me. I believe this belongs to you. My fingers hesitated before accepting it. The handwriting across the front was instantly familiar. It matched the sealed letter waiting unopened inside my safe at home. Only this envelope carried a different message. In Wallace's unmistakable script were 6 words. Give this to Evelyn when truth begins. I stared at those words, feeling the entire room waiting for my reaction. For the first time since walking into the ballroom, I realized this night had never been about a wedding. It had always been about a truth that had been waiting decades to find me. I held the envelope in both hands without opening it. The weight of the paper felt strangely familiar, as though it carried far more than a few written pages. Around me, more than 200 guests remained frozen in silence, waiting for someone to explain what any of this meant. I slowly looked up from Wallace's handwriting and met James's eyes. Whatever secret he had been carrying, it had clearly cost him dearly. I'm sorry, he said quietly enough that only those nearest could hear. I should have done this sooner. Before I could respond, Richard strode across the ballroom. His polished public image had vanished completely. His face burned with anger. You've gone far enough. He reached toward the envelope in my hands. Give me that. For the first time all evening, I stepped backward. No. The single word surprised even me. Richard stopped. Our eyes met. There had once been a time when a single glare from him would have made me apologize for simply existing. That woman no longer stood before him. You have no right to those documents, he snapped. James immediately stepped between us. Actually, she does. Richard pointed a trembling finger at him. You've destroyed this wedding. No, James answered calmly. The truth did. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances. Phones quietly appeared beneath tables. Some were already searching Wallace Cole's name online. Others were looking up mine. I noticed the familiar glow of phone screens spreading throughout the ballroom like tiny stars. Someone near the front suddenly whispered, loudly enough, for several nearby tables to hear. Wait. Another voice answered. She's Evelyn Cole. No, not that Evelyn Cole. The CEO? Within seconds, the whisper began traveling from table to table. Guests stared at me, then back down at their phones. One elderly businessman removed his reading glasses, leaned closer to his screen, then looked at me again in complete disbelief. My God. His voice carried farther than he intended. It is her. A woman beside him gasped. She was on the cover of Business Today last month. Another guest added quietly. Didn't Forbes name her one of the top executives under 40? The room began changing before my eyes. Only minutes earlier, I had been the forgotten daughter, hidden behind a flower arrangement. Now people were looking at me with entirely different expressions. Curiosity, recognition, respect. Richard noticed it too. His confidence cracked for the first time. "They're exaggerating," he said sharply. No one answered him. Instead, more guests continued searching. Someone spoke from another table. "Coal Logistics." Another voice interrupted. "They've acquired dozens of companies." A third added, "I've done business with them." I closed my eyes briefly. This was never how I wanted them to learn who I was. James looked at me apologetically. "I know you never wanted your success to become part of this." I nodded slightly. "You're right." Then I took a slow breath and walked toward the front of the ballroom. The crowd instinctively moved aside. No one spoke. No one stopped me. When I reached the microphone, I looked across the room that had laughed at me only minutes earlier. I wasn't planning to say anything tonight. My voice remained calm despite the storm inside me. I came because I wanted closure. Silence. I accepted the invitation, believing I would sit quietly, congratulate my sister, and leave before anyone noticed. I glanced toward Noreen. She lowered her eyes. That was enough for me. I turned back toward the guests. "My name is Evelyn Cole." A few people nodded, already recognizing it. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Cole Logistics." The silence deepened. "I built the company from a rented warehouse 20 years ago." No applause followed. Only stunned attention. I didn't come here looking for recognition. My gaze settled briefly on Richard. I certainly didn't come here looking for revenge. Then I smiled faintly. There is, however, one piece of information that seems relevant tonight. Several guests leaned forward. The Ashford estate. I slowly looked around the magnificent ballroom, where my sister chose to celebrate one of the most important days of her life. I paused. Is owned by my company. A collective gasp swept across the room. People looked around instinctively, almost as though seeing the ballroom for the first time. I continued quietly. The hospitality group that operates this estate became part of Cole Logistics earlier this year. I gestured gently toward the elegant surroundings. "So tonight," another pause. "My company is hosting this wedding." Absolute silence. One woman actually covered her mouth. Several executives stared at Richard with open disbelief. I heard someone whisper behind me, "He publicly humiliated the woman paying for his daughter's wedding." The irony was impossible to ignore. Richard looked as though he might collapse. His mouth opened several times, but no words came. Across the ballroom, the elderly woman I had noticed earlier slowly rose from her chair. She looked directly at me. Then, with quiet dignity, she began applauding. One pair of hands. Nothing more. For several seconds, she stood alone. Then another guest joined her. And another. Soon, the applause spread throughout the ballroom. Not loud. Not celebratory. Respectful. The kind of applause reserved for someone who had endured far more than anyone had realized. I wasn't sure how to react. This wasn't victory. It certainly wasn't happiness. It felt like something much more complicated. Recognition. After an entire lifetime of being unseen. When the applause finally faded, I stepped away from the microphone. Business leaders began approaching almost immediately. One extended his hand. "I've wanted to meet you for years." Another smiled apologetically. "I had no idea you were Richard's daughter. I hope we can speak sometime about a partnership." Business cards appeared one after another. Conversations that would normally have happened inside corporate boardrooms were suddenly beginning in the middle of my sister's wedding reception. Across the room, Richard stood completely alone. The same people who had surrounded him only half an hour earlier now walked past him without stopping. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not fear of losing money. Not fear of losing status. Fear of losing the story he had spent decades telling everyone about me. And somehow, I knew the night's greatest revelation still hadn't been spoken aloud. Here's something I'd like to leave you with before we say goodbye. Stories like this remind us that the deepest wounds are often not caused by strangers, but by the people we trust most. Words spoken inside a family can shape a child's heart for decades, either giving them the confidence to face the world or leaving scars that take a lifetime to heal. Yet this story also teaches us that our past does not have to define our future. We cannot choose the family we are born into, but we can choose the person we become. Success is never about proving our worth to those who refuse to see it. Real success is building a life that reflects our values, protecting our peace, and refusing to let bitterness become our identity. If someone has underestimated you, don't waste your energy seeking revenge. Let your character, your perseverance, and your actions become the answer. At the same time, if you are a parent, remember that every word of encouragement or criticism may stay with your child far longer than you ever imagine. Never compare your children. Never make one feel less loved than another, and never allow your own regrets to become their burden. The greatest legacy we can leave behind is not wealth or success, but love, fairness, and the courage to break painful cycles so the next generation can live differently. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone, I hope you'll share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for spending your time with me today, and I look forward to sharing another unforgettable story with you in the next video.